I would like to introduce the speaker. George M. Johnson is an award-winning Black non-binary writer, author, and activist located in the New York City area. They were awarded the 2019 Salute to Excellence Award by the National Association of Black Journalists for their article, When Racism Anchors Your Health, and recently named to the Root 100 Most Influential African Americans in 2020. They are the author of the best-selling young adult memoir, All Boys Art in Blue, discussing their adolescence growing up as a young Black queer boy in New Jersey through a series of powerful essays. Their book has been optioned for television by Gabrielle Union and Sony TV. George is an HIV and LGBTQ activist, serving as chair of the Black Leadership AIDS Crisis Coalition for Black Gay Men for AIDS Healthcare Foundation, a national advisor for ViiV Pharmaceutical and Gilead speaker. They are also called on to discuss various issues facing the LGBTQ community, from civil rights leaders to politicians. As a journalist, George has written for major and niche media outlets like Teen Vogue, Entertainment Tonight, NBC, The Root, BuzzFeed, Essence, Ebony, Them, and The Griot. They have also served as a guest editor for BET.com's Pride Month. On social media, George has an impressive presence with nearly 80,000 engaged followers on Twitter who are always eager to see what George is writing next. George is also a proud HBCU alum twice over and a member of Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity Incorporated. At this time, we will transition into a dramatic reading of the first chapter of All Boys Art in Blue.
Everybody, it's your girl Jennifer Lewis. Yes. Now, as you know from my own fabulous memoir, The Mother of Black Hollywood, I've been doing what I can since the 80s to fight this virus. After all of these years and all the lives we've lost, it's time to come together. We got to come together as a community to end the stigma and end the disease. Y'all take it from Auntie. Community is our superpower. Now get on out of here and enjoy the show. Go ahead on. All right now.
Hello, my name is George M. Johnson, and I am the author of All Boys Are Blue. Black history has always included LGBTQ people. Whether it was the brilliance of the Harlem Renaissance, or the Black history that was the Stonewall riots, or the 40+ years that Black queer people have stood at the forefront of the HIV movement. Blackness is inherently queer. My story is another story in that history. The story of a young Black kid growing up in the little city of Plainfield, New Jersey, with a supporting and loving Black family. At the center of that family sat my grandmother, Nanny, a Southern Black woman who didn't take any mess. My Black queer story is one of tragedy, it is one of triumph, and it is one of the Black experience. I am Black, I am queer, and I am HIV positive. My story is told through this timely and important lens. Welcome to the world of All Boys Aren't Blue.
All right, Kay. Now, I know you just had the baby, and Gregory said the baby's name's gonna be George. Now, I ain't trying to run your household, but I'm not calling no baby George. So we're gonna sit here, and we're gonna go through this Bible and find a middle name for him, because, I ain't calling him George. Let's just call the baby Matthew, y'all. Matthew's a good name.
I was 5 years old when my teeth got kicked out. It was my first trauma. But before I get into that, introductions. My name is Matthew Johnson. Well, realistically, my name is George Matthew Johnson, but at the age of 5, I didn't know that yet. I'm from a small city located in New Jersey called Plainfield, about 30 miles from the bright lights of Manhattan. It's a place I once hated, but grew to love as my true home, my only home. My family's been a part of the fabric of the city for more than 50 years. My brother and I grew up middle class, or what black folks were supposed to think was middle class, with Christmases full of gifts under the tree. My little brother and I never wanted for a thing. Family was first for us. My family provided the kind of upbringing and support system that anyone would want their children to have. Unfortunately, my life story is proof that no amount of money, love, or support can protect you from a society intent on killing you for your blackness. As I said, I was 5 years old when my teeth were kicked out. By that age, I already knew I was different, even though I didn't have the language to explain it or maturity to understand fully what different meant. At 5, I wasn't allowed to walk to my grandmother's house, who I affectionately call Nanny, from school by myself. So I walked home with my older cousins, Little Raul and Rasul. I usually walked holding hands with Little Raul while Rasul went ahead. Living so close to the school, I'm sure Nanny never imagined within those 10 minutes, her grandchild's life would be forever scarred. The memory's vivid. You can still smell the air from that day. Sunny, mild, spring-like weather. We were at the corner of Lansdowne and Marshall on the lawn of the corner house when we ran into a group of kids from the neighborhood that I didn't recognize. They had to be my cousins' ages, around 9 or 10 years old. The main kid was white. The other kids were black and white, if memory serves me correctly. My cousins knew who they were, I guessed, because they immediately began arguing. When I sit with this memory, there's no sound in the moment, but I can see it. There were 3 of us, and there were 6 of them. But really, it was 2 on 6, because what did a 5-year-old know about fighting? The arguing kept getting more intense, with my fear growing as the boys got closer in each other's faces. Before I knew it, the argument broke into a fight, and I, the invisible boy, somehow became the biggest target. As my cousin squared up with the 3 boys, 2 others grabbed me by the arms and held me on the ground. I screamed for help, as it was all I could do. The 3rd kid swung his leg and kicked me in the face. Then he pulled his leg back again and kicked even harder. My teeth shattered like glass hitting the concrete. In that moment, I felt nothing. It's as if it were all a dream. And then I felt the pain. I also felt an emotion I had never experienced before. Rage. I didn't fully understand that feeling at the time, had not yet had the pleasure of introducing myself to it. The tears that streamed down my face were no longer about pain. I was now crying tears of anger, tears of rage. Ah! That rage was enough to stop the boy from ever bringing a third kick to my face. I somehow broke free, lunged forward, and bit his leg with the teeth that I had remaining. He screamed so loud as I bit through his jeans. And by this time, my cousins had handled the other three boys and saw what had happened to me. They ran toward us, which made my assaulters retreat, and they grabbed my book bag and they said, "Run to the house, Matt!" Sound is now back on in the memory. I can hear myself crying as I ran home. I got to my grandmother's house and I continued to cry. Bloodied mouth, busted lip, and baby teeth knocked out. "What happened?" yelled Nanny. "We got jumped," my cousins explained. Nanny went and got ice and wrapped it in a paper towel, and she told me to hold it to my face. It all gets a little fuzzy after that as I remember bits and pieces of what occurred. When my mother got there, she came and checked on me immediately. She sat in one of the dining room chairs and had me sit in her lap with her arms around me. I think back on that day a lot. There were no counselors or therapy sessions to help me work through what had happened. Therapy is still a very much taboo subject in the Black community. You know, those who are seen as having issues with their mental health face a lot of stigma and discrimination because mental health is often conflated with mental illness. So rather than having their child be labeled as something hurtful, my parents did the best they could do with what they knew. We did what we always did as a family. We loved on each other even harder. But the next day became just that. The next day. What happened the day before was to be forgotten, or better yet, buried. Unfortunately, what I also forgot was how to smile. I immediately became self-conscious about smiling. It's something that I struggled to deal with even as an adult. Because my baby teeth had been kicked out, my adult teeth, almost buck teeth, grew in extremely early. Adult-sized teeth on a 7-year-old are extremely odd looking. And it brought me a whole new type of attention I wasn't looking for. My lips became protection for the smile that was stolen. Picture after picture after picture, I refused to smile. What did I look like to others? A child who rarely smiled. Did they ever take it as a sign that I was dealing with a trauma I couldn't get past? Or did they just pass it off as a boys will be boys thing that I would eventually grow out of? To go years without smiling in pictures, rarely being questioned why, leaves me to ask the question, what other signs of trauma do we miss or ignore in Black children? Black boys are supposed to be rough and tough, to suck up the pain and not shed a tear. Being Black and queer brings on layers of issues. There can be both a fear of your own community and a fear of dealing with bullying from other children who don't respect your identity. When that kind of pressure builds within a young queer kid, the fear becomes constricting and can wrap you in layers each more difficult to peel away as you grow up. As an adult, I've gone through the unlearning to understand that my community's treatment of Black queer children is in fact a byproduct of a system of assimilation to whiteness and respectability that forces Black people to fit one mold in society. One where being a man means you must be straight and masculine. I didn't have the ability to separate my Blackness from my queerness. The loss of my smile was as much a denial of my Black joy as it was my queer joy. When I did smile, it was a coping mechanism. My smile was a mask that hid the pain of suppressing who I was. Trauma appears all throughout pop culture. often sung by the masses as a hot lyric, penned by the performer as a release of that pain. The trauma is shared by the community too. Songs become our battle cries, and the trauma becomes the thing that bonds us together. When I hear Cardi B say she got a bag and fixed her teeth, it's more than a cute line in a dope song, and yes, Bodak Yellow was a bop. But she was responding to years of hate and flack she received for having crooked teeth. She is talking about the trauma she dealt with and what she was able to do to gain back agency over those moments and then use it in a way to make folks proud. Every time she talks about her teeth, she is allowing herself to work through the process of healing rather than be burdened by the weight of holding the trauma in. January 15th, 2015 would signal a change in my smile-related trauma. My mother had 2 brain aneurysms that day. As a 30-year-old, I knew I had to hold it together. I was her eldest, and I knew she would need me. I remember the doctor saying, "It's time to take her back to the prep room." My dad stood on one side of her bed and I stood on the other. He leaned in and gave her a kiss, and she said, "I'm gonna be fine." I stood there, nervous, terrified. I finally gave her a kiss too. As I pulled away, she could see that I was choking up. In that moment, I felt like that 5-year-old boy sitting in my mother's lap after his teeth got kicked out. As a tear rolled from each of my eyes, she looked up at me and said, "Smile, Matt. Just smile." I gave her the biggest smile I ever had since the day I lost it. My mom survived her surgery, and I learned a valuable lesson about holding on to trauma. It is necessary that we do the work to unpack our shit. It's time that we let Black queer boys unpack their shit. Smile, Black boys. Smile.
Hello, everyone. So my name is George M. Johnson. That was a dramatic reading of my book. That was the first chapter from the book entitled Smile. The name of the book is All Boys Aren't Blue. The actor who actually did that was Delon Burnside from Pose, as well as Jennifer Lewis was doing the voice of my grandmother, Nanny, at the beginning. I guess when Christopher asked me to come and kind of talk about this, representation, identity, and diversity. That's pretty much what my book and what my livelihood is all about, especially around the Black family. My book specifically discusses my childhood from birth until age 21. It is one of the first and only young adult Black queer memoirs that currently exists in the market. I specifically wrote the book because people always ask, why did I write the book? I specifically wrote the book because there's a quote on my arm by Toni Morrison that says, if there's a book that you want to read and it hasn't been written yet, then you must write it. Growing up being Black and queer and not having any representation at all within my childhood, within school systems, within the text that we were reading, it was like a double isolation. I was already isolated within the classrooms that I was in, isolated within the family dynamic that I was in, and then further isolated because the text that we were given had no type of representation of me in them. Even when we were reading text about Black people or Black kids, they were still centered around heterosexual people. Even when we were reading texts that were written by Black queer people like Langston Hughes, they never told us that Langston Hughes was also a part of the LGBT community. And so by them keeping those certain pieces of those people from us, people like myself growing up as a Black queer child never knew that I existed. I've dealt with, I always say I knew I was different by the time I was 5 years old. My mother and my grandmother knew I was different by the time I was 2. And so it goes, I guess, to say that you do see signs very early on in children that they are not following society's standard of like a paradigm of how quote unquote boys are supposed to act and move and mannerisms. All of my effeminate behavior and my mannerisms were being seen since I was the age of 2. When my grandmother and my mother noticed it, my grandmother simply said to my mother, "I think we have another one." I grew up in a family that has had queer people before. I grew up with a transgender cousin. Her name was Hope, and I actually wrote a chapter about her in the book. So as my grandmother always said, LGBTQ people have always run in our family. And so they've always been welcome and accepted in our family. And as, you know, this was the early 90s. So to have someone who was fully transitioning back in the 90s, you know, that's not even something that we get to see happen safely now. So to think 30 years ago, my family was already dealing with trans people within the family dynamic and how the church would react and how people would look at our family differently because we simply loved on the people who were in my family. So at 5, when I say I was different, it was simply that I knew that I had an attraction to boys. And I had an attraction to girls, but only tomboys, which I don't even know if they still use that term anymore. And I think, I'm pretty sure everybody knows what a tomboy is, but it was just a girl who was like very like masculine or used to wear boys' clothing and used to not go into like things that girls would like to do. They used to be more attracted to things that typically boys would like to do. But I was always attracted to those type of girls very, very, very young. And I only remember that because I remember in kindergarten giving a Valentine to the tomboy, and like, I just remember that moment of like, oh, that was an interesting choice for that to be your Valentine. But in my mind, it was trying to process something that was very high level, like my identity, without knowing what was actually going on with me. By the time I was about 7 or 8 was when the effeminate nature, I guess, of myself started to showcase itself more. When I was in the 2nd grade, I created a word called honey child. And I used to say it the same way that people say like child or like child please or like girl, or like how you would say that is how I said it. But I was only 7 years old and this was 1992. And so I started saying it primarily with the girls that I was hanging with. And so then they started saying it. And slowly but surely, they started saying it in their homes. And so when they said it in their homes, their parents were like, well, where did y'all get that word from? I think had the word come from a girl, their parents would have let it slide. But because the word came from a boy, the parents called my teacher and the teacher called my mom. And my mother one night called me in the living room and said that I could no longer use the word. And she didn't say why I couldn't use the word, but she said I could no longer use the word. But that was the first time that I really experienced, like, I guess what we would say is homophobia. And experiencing that even as a 7-year-old, I didn't know how to name it. I didn't know what it was, but I knew what it was related to. And I knew it was related to my effeminate behavior. By the time I was 10, that was when other kids started to pick apart my identity. And so it is kind of interesting because it's like when kids are just kids, it's okay until you get to around a certain age. And then kids start to take the biases that their parents have given them and they start to enact it in school settings. And so it's like you have like your own society. I don't know if anyone ever remembers the cartoon. It was called Recess, but like the kids had like a king And like, basically it was like how how kids in elementary school have like their own hierarchy. And so that's kind of realistic though. And so like as a kid, there was a hierarchy. You had kids who were more masculine, who got treated differently than kids who were more effeminate. And you had the kids who maybe had a little bit of muscle be treated differently than fat kids. And it was like this whole hierarchy that was built, like its own system of like adulthood for kids. And I was 10 years old when my friend, his name was Pete Grote, I was double dutching. I don't know if anybody knows what that is, but that's jump roping with 2 ropes simultaneously. Because I used to like double dutching during recess with the girls. And I was double dutching and he came up from the football field and he was like, some of the other boys are starting to call you the F word. And so literally that day I was standing up and he was like, I don't like them calling you that. So he was like, could you just come and play football with us just this one time, just to make them stop thinking that you don't do boy sports. And I just remember thinking about safety in that moment. And so again, a 10-year-old now, by the time of the age of 10, I have processed being different. I have processed masculinity. I have processed homophobia. And now I'm processing even further safety. And I was like, all right, I'll go play football. Now, the kids didn't know that I grew up in a household with my 2 cousins, Raul and Rasul, who grew up in the projects and were like very rough and tough, like with me, like outside of setting. So I could fight, I could play sports, I could do all of those things because I did it with them all the time. I just didn't like to do it at school, but none of the school kids knew that. So when I went down to the football field, I was actually one of the best players. And everybody was shocked, but that was the last day that I did double dutching. And from that day on, I played football every day because at that moment I learned basically, this is how I can create safety for myself, even being someone who clearly I know that I'm dealing with something with my identity. As long as I can play these sports as well as these boys, and as long as I play them well enough that I don't get picked last, which I never got picked last, that was enough for them to bypass looking at my identity and teasing me about my identity or bullying me about my identity. And I watched them do it to other kids. And so it was like one of those things where it's like, that was something I did not want to happen to myself. By the time I got into middle school, that was when things started to really take a turn for me. Then you have to start going to school dances. And I did go to an 8th grade prom with a girl. Her name was Jade Williams. It was fine. It worked out. But at that same time, what I was dealing with on the home front was an older cousin who was kind of masculine, kind of effeminate, had a girlfriend, but secretly was sexually abusing me. And I was around the age of 12, 13 when that happened. And I just recalled the moments because it happened twice. And I recall when it happened, it was one of those hard things to process because it was one of those things where it was like, everything about this is wrong, but your body doesn't necessarily respond that way. Because your body going through puberty is saying, this is a male and this is what you are attracted to. And so it was really, really hard to reconcile that once again as a 12-year-old, a 13-year-old who had no real frame of reference for what my identity was going to be or what it was. And at that time, because I had a transgender cousin, that was the only thing that I could think that I was going to be, was transgender, because I was so effeminate. I thought at some point, okay, I'm going to transition. And so then this happens. And it literally removed my sexual agency. And from that point, I just stopped thinking about even having sex with another person. It made me recede even further into, I guess, what people would say a closet. And I just kind of rejected the notion of even talking about it for a very, very long time. I always like to say I survived high school. I went to Catholic school. I was in the minority population of a bunch of, and I had went to public school my whole life. So I was with Black kids for my whole life. And then right after dealing with the sexual trauma, cast into a school where now I am a minority. And so all of these things are now intersecting at the same time. But what also was growing in me was just this desire to not fit the status quo. And so I just decided not to. So I always sat as like an outlier, even within community. I was always intelligent, so I always had good grades. So that was something I could always lean into. I was always good at sports, so nobody really said anything to my face in terms of being too effeminate. And I think everybody thought I could fight. And so I think everybody was also kind of afraid, because there's also those rumors about how gay kids can fight. And that was a rumor way back then. It is something that people still say now. Like, you will hear adults say, like, you don't mess with them, because you tend to have to, like, when you get into fights as a queer person, you're literally thinking about your life. Like, you're not just thinking about winning a fight, you're thinking about surviving. And so your fight looks a little bit different. And I think kids knew that even back then. Like, you do not mess with them, because they go to a different place when they are defending themselves. Because we live in a state, I always say, like, as queer people, we live in a state of rage, because we just never know who's going to try us that day. So you're always having to be ready. And so by high school, still was not identifying as anything but just George. Had no desire to tell anyone that I was gay. And was only asked by one person who I'm still friends with to this day. And he was gay. He was 2 years younger than me. But we both said that we weren't when we asked each other at that time. But now 15, well, no, high school, so it's not 15, but 20 years later. 20 years later, we are still really good friends. And we talk about that, the story of how we survived high school, not being able to truly be ourselves. I actually recently wrote an article that went pretty viral, just about how Black queer kids have to go through a second adolescence that typically goes through their adulthood. The skills that my brother was able to learn, simply like dating. My brother started dating when he was 13. Because I was closeted, I didn't start dating till I was almost 25. And that put me 12 years behind from learning a social skill that most kids get to learn when they are teenagers. And so I have this theory, so to speak, that Black queer people specifically, we have to live through a second adolescence, which typically starts around the age of 21 to 23, when we can have some type of independence and live in our identity and go to gay clubs and be around other queer people and have community, which delays us about 10 years. And so when you're seeing a lot of heterosexual people who are able to be married, start their families and all those things around 27, 37, I think that's why you see so many queer people almost delayed so much to where they're in their 30s, almost 40s many times, doing a lot of the things that heterosexual people were able to figure out, because they got those skill sets when they were teenagers, and we didn't even get to attempt learning those skill sets until we were adults. By then, I then went to college at Virginia Union University. And in college, that was when I had to finally come face to face with the identity issue, because you just could not continue to hide it anymore, because it was just too much of a setting and just too many people in your business, especially at a school so small. I pledged Alpha Phi Alpha my junior year, the Gamma chapter, and it was within the org. Interestingly enough, I was running away from, or I was trying to chase masculinity that whole time. So I was like, okay, I'm going to join this fraternity. I'm going to prove I am this person. I am tough enough and I'm smart enough and I can be this member and all of these things. And interestingly enough, I ran into the community I had always been running away from. What I ended up meeting within the org were people who were like me, and people who were running from those same things. And we ended up all finding each other. And then as you started to matriculate into the org and see older people, I was able to meet older men who also had a queer experience and were able to be mentors or be able to give guidance and able to kind of show me that you can exist in this particular body and still have an effeminate nature about you. So by that time was when I really realized, like, I didn't necessarily have to transition, and I didn't need to be trans to be who I was, but I still was on a journey of figuring out if my identity was truly just simply being gay or if it was more than that. I am now 35 years old. At the beginning, I believe, yes, at the beginning in my bio, you heard that I identify as non-binary. It has been a true journey of figuring out who I am and what my identity actually is. I think identity is something that can change over time for so many people. I don't think it's something that you just figure out one day and then that's just it. I have identified as heterosexual for safety. I've identified as gay because I thought that was all that made sense. I've identified as queer. I identified as gender fluid. I now identify as non-binary. And the journey to get to this place was a conversation that I had with my grandmother, who recently passed away about a year ago. And before she passed away, we were talking, and she literally just looked at me and she was like, "You're not just gay, right?" And I said, "No." And she was like, "All right, well, the ladies at the church keep asking me and they call me Matt by my middle name, if Matt is gay." And I keep telling them, "No, Matt's not just gay, but if you want to know, ask Matt." So I said, "Okay." So I was like, "Well, what do you think I am?" And she literally looked at me and she said, "Well, you've never been a boy, but you've never been a girl, but you've always sat somewhere in between. And I don't know what you call that, but that's what you are." And it was really, really profound for me in that moment, because here she was, 78 years old with a brain tumor, knowing that she was in her final months. But one, I think when we talk about the Black family, this was still a Black woman who really, really believed that you don't leave the earth without making sure you close up all of the loops. And so that was her doing her work to make sure that she had closed up this one loop that started 30 something years ago that she had knew, but she knew I still wasn't where I needed to be yet. And that was her doing her work to make sure, okay, I'm telling you, this is who you are. So go ahead and be it now. And two, it really was for me coming to this place of, I always have had this masculine and feminine energy that she could see, that everybody could see. It just happens to sit in a body that the world has deemed is man. That doesn't then just make you that, right? Like, I am not, in many ways, like I teach people, it is almost reductionist to think that simply because of how we look, that is all we can be. Like, simply because my image is the image of what society has deemed as man, I cannot be anything but this particular type of person that fits into this particular type of body. And I always say, it's the parts that you can't see that really make up who you are. It's not the parts that we can see, because these parts, this is just what we came into the world as. But if we truly believe, as I do, that we have ancestors, and we truly believe in spirituality and all of these things, then we have to believe that it is the parts that you cannot see that make up who we are. And so when we tell you from our mouths, this is who I am, part of the push of me as a non-binary person is to deconstruct this notion that gender even looks like a thing. When I think about identity, I think about how when a doctor says it's a girl, that literally means simply because I said that you are a girl, you now will make 70% to the dollar of what a man will make. You now will have to go through society, and you can never have this type of position or this type of job because I have called you a girl, because I have labeled you this one thing. It literally sets you up on this path of where you will always be fighting to break a glass ceiling simply just because I told you you were a girl. When a doctor says you have a boy and a boy comes out like myself, I then have to fight to break every glass ceiling simply because society is always going to tell me, well, no, look at your image. This doctor said you're this thing that makes you this thing, and now you have to go through life as this thing, and you have to be this thing. And the more that you are not this thing, the more outside factors will continue to try and suppress the thing that you are trying to tell them that you truly are. And so that kind of goes into the titling of the book. When I say all boys aren't blue, it simply is saying that when we have those gender reveals and the pink smoke goes up or the blue smoke goes up, it doesn't really mean anything. Blue smoke could have came up in 1985 for my mom and my dad. 35 years later, they will tell you, the blue smoke really didn't mean much in how our child turned out to be. And so I always tell this particular story just around identity because it truly is a journey. And there are many of us that are on it, whether we are trans and non-binary, gender fluid. And I always say what happens is you will see an expansion, which is why you see so many letters in the acronym LGBTQIA, KP+, which is the full acronym. And you may see some more added because you have to always expand before you can condense. Because the ultimate goal is, one, let's recognize what actually exists, because we've always existed, even if we've never been acknowledged, we've always existed. So now we're in a space where we can say, okay, all of these things exist. And then you will see the contraction, because the ultimate goal is to live in a society where gender doesn't matter. Because when gender and we live in a binary and it matters, it literally just harms people. To be genderless means there is no wage gap. To be genderless means there is no healthcare insecurity. There is no houseless gap. There is no, like, none of those systems that operate based off of whether you are man or woman all go away. And it evens the playing field. And what it does is it tears down other systems of oppression. And so that is part of what my work is, living and existing as someone who identifies as non-binary, to tell people it truly is not what you see on the outside. It is truly the insides that make me who I am. The Black family is super important. I come from a Black family. I always say, there is this notion that Black community is more homophobic than other communities. It's simply not true. Do we have homophobia? Absolutely. Does every community have homophobia? Absolutely. Do we get demonized in a way because of how homophobia is portrayed in our community? Absolutely. We do have an issue with the killings and the murdering of Black trans women. And we do have an issue with the violence that LGBTQ people face in our community. But it doesn't mean that our community has not moved to a place where we appreciate and support and also can love the LGBTQ people that have come from it. We have James Baldwin, we have Audre Lorde, we have Marsha P. Johnson. We have our LGBTQ trailblazers that people respect and people love and people herald. And so, part of the work, even within the Black family, is to move us to this place where identity doesn't matter in that way. One of the things that was said in chapter 1 was how the way that we persecute queer people, especially within the Black community, it is simply because of assimilation. Assimilation has taught us that you oppress the group that's below you to attain or hold on to any power that you have. And so we have watched white community do that on their hierarchy to want to hold power and wield power. And in turn, we have just taken the system and the model that they have and just filtered it through our own community. If we are able to, as Black communities, when we are able to recognize that us giving power to the most harmed doesn't take power from us, but only gives us power, that is truly how we move to a place of liberation and freedom. And so that is also part of the work I do as an activist, is making people recognize that homophobia and transphobia is actually a byproduct of misogyny. And so we live in a patriarchal society. And so if you fix the misogyny, you'd in turn fix homophobia, which would in turn fix transphobia. But that's many of the problems that we run into just in the Black family setup, in the Black family dynamic, where women have always been the backbone of Black community in many, many ways, but never given the proper credit, never given the proper power to even hold positions that move our community forward. When you think about how the civil rights movement and all of the things within our community have happened, typically our leaders have always been Black men. Even when they talk now more so about the March on Washington, they talk about how Dorothy Height was blocked from being able to speak at the March on Washington, which was a huge problem because she's literally, many people call her the architect, and they did not allow her to speak simply because she was a woman. And so now, almost 60 years later, we are still dealing with many of those issues within the Black community where Black heterosexual men have struggled to want to give up that power position. I could say all the right things. A lot of times I do say all the right things. I could never lead our community simply because I'm queer. If I were heterosexual, I would be a millionaire by now. I would be on every TV show by now. I would be, and we all know this because I don't say the wrong things. It is simply that the message is not coming from the right person. And so that is one of the things that I feel like, especially even within like the Black family, as communities, we are working on how do we look at leadership, which I guess touches on diversity. How do we look at leadership from this angle that a queer person could lead us to freedom, or a queer person could lead us out of oppression, or a woman could lead us to freedom, or a woman could lead us out of oppression. And so I think that's part of what goes into a lot of my activism, is kind of showcasing that this is not an attack on anyone within my community. This is simply to say that diversity doesn't look like, oh, we've hired a Black person, or it doesn't look like, oh, we've hired an Asian person, or it doesn't look like, it is, we have given equity and we have given equality to these communities so that these communities as a whole are able to move up. And then when you look at what diversifying even within our own Black communities look like, for me, it looks like queer people leadership, and it looks like women, women who have a lens on protecting queer people in leadership, because we also have problems there too. Sometimes you put a certain person in the right position and that person still operates from a heterosexual lens, which still continues to harm those marginalized communities below them. When I also think about just, I guess one more thing I wanted to really, really touch on, when we talk about just like LGBTQ community, there are still two communities. There's still an LGBTQ community and a Black LGBTQ community. It was 3 or 4 years ago when during Philadelphia Pride, they decided, the Black LGBTQ people decided they wanted to put a Black stripe and a brown stripe on the rainbow flag. And it created a hellstorm across the country from mainly white queer people who basically showed that although they could live within a marginalized group, they also still were racist and still carried out many of the things that the group of heterosexual people also carried out against us. It's interesting to see when you have, especially we live in a community where we literally have witnessed gays for Trump. We witnessed Caitlyn Jenner, like people who were willing to, in many ways, vote in a way that harmed them, like self-inflicted harm, simply to protect their whiteness. And that is something that us as Black queer people have to deal with when we are intersecting with white LGBT people. We still have to deal with a huge level of anti-Blackness, a huge level of racism, even within spaces that are supposed to be our safe spaces. And so that divide has also created where I like to say, if you really think about it, while white LGBTQ people were fighting for marriage equality, Black LGBTQ people were fighting to survive. And so when marriage equality was passed in, I believe that was 2012, either 2012 or 2013 when it officially was passed, there were a lot of white LGBTQ organizations that didn't know what the next thing was for them. Unfortunately for me, my community was still fighting the HIV epidemic. The one that everybody seemingly thought had went away is still an epidemic for Black LGBTQ people, which is why I do a lot of HIV activism and work. As someone who is living with HIV, it is important that I have to continue to do this work, because within Black LGBTQ people, our highest group of people who acquire the virus is age 13 to 24. So that is not something that has ever left our community. And so when we switch into like the activism lens, a lot of my activism is centered in HIV, because at the current rate of infection, if we continue to go on the current trend that we are going, Black men who have sex with men, 50% of Black men who have sex with men will acquire the virus in their lifetime. So that would be 1 in 2 if we continue at the infection rate of Black men who have sex with men. And that is unfathomable. I mean, if there were any other virus that were affecting white communities in that way, it would be eradicated immediately. And so that is part of like the activism work that I have to do, is centered in HIV work, also centered in homelessness, as LGBTQ youth also deal with exponentially higher rates of homelessness than heterosexual youth, where over 40% of LGBTQ youth are Black and brown, even though we don't make up most of the LGBTQ population. We make up almost half of the homelessness that's experienced within that community. So that is also something, when I think about the Black family, that we have had to do. In talking about family, you have your nuclear family, which typically is the family you come from. And then you have what we queer people call created family. So created family is how we have survived for centuries. Millennia, I don't know, how we've always survived. Created family is basically how we have turned friends into our family. There are many people who have lost their nuclear family, whether it was because of their identity or mainly because of their identity, and have literally had to seek out family in friendships, and that then becomes your family. The community known as the ballroom community, there's a show called Pose. The ballroom community is practically a community, it is created family. Fraternities and sororities, in many ways, are created family. That is why the people within your organizations, typically you don't call them friends, you call them brothers or you call them sisters. Because it is another version of created family, because a lot of people join those orgs when they don't have support systems in their back home in their lives, and those then become their new families. Created family in many ways is how especially young LGBTQ people have had to learn to exist and to survive. Even before they know what created family is, many of them are in created families. I myself exist in many different pockets of communities. So I am a member of Alpha Phi Alpha. I do have a lot of community ties to the ballroom community. I have a lot of ties to the HIV community. And so I get to move from group to group to group. But in doing so, I also get to start to create the dynamics that will shape our next generations coming in. And so a lot of what I do now, primarily with writing the book, because the book is a form of activism, is how do I take everything that I've been through and now start to shape what the next generation won't have to go through. And so I always say everything that I've been through and everything that I currently go through, I'm doing all of this so that they don't have to go through it. And so now we're in a space where, because we have visibility and representation, I think that was one of the other ones, was representation. Visibility and representation is just a starting point. I always say it's not the ending point. It's been sold as the ending point, much like symbolism. So it's kind of like when you think about Barack Obama becoming president, it's like, oh, look how far you've come, when realistically it's like, no, look how long you kept us from being these things. Because that's really what it is. And so the fact that we are in 2021 and we are still having headlines that say first Black person to be governor of this state, first Black person to have this job, first Black person to, that's really not great. Like, that's not a good thing. And we look at it as like, oh, we broke a ceiling, when realistically it's like, well, no, it actually is the other side that we need to be talking about, which is why are we still having first Black anything this long into integration, this long after the Emancipation Proclamation, this long after the Civil Rights Act of 65? Like, why are we still having that happen? And so that is what visibility and representation, unfortunately, that's the bad side of it, if you look at that as our ending point. And so I think now people now are starting more so to realize, like, that is just our starting point. Once we get visibility and representation, you then have to take that visibility and representation and replicate it into micro level society. And so, yes, it is great that I get to be a Black non-binary person with a best-selling book and working on a TV show. And I get to exist in these rooms and walk through spaces safely sometimes and have all of these things. What is not great is that Nigel Shelby could not do that. Even though I was existing and I was visible, Nigel Shelby was a gay kid who also was existing and was also visible. And that just made Nigel a target until Nigel died by suicide. And so at the age of 15. And so when I think about representation and visibility, it is only a starting point. And what we then need to do is take that representation on that macro level and figure out, now, how do we make this a micro level thing? I mean, events like this make it micro level. People get to hear the story. People then get to take it back into their homes and talk to their kids and talk to other people about it. I can even say earlier today, one of my fraternity brothers of 15 years, well, I've known him for 15 years. He's a chapter brother, sent me a text message today saying that his son came out to him. And I thought that was really, really powerful. One, because he contacted me first. And two, he now has my book. So he now has a tool that, if this would have happened when I was a child, we didn't have this tool. But now we had a conversation today where I can say, I am not only visibility and representation, but I have now given you a guide that you can hand to your son, that your son can read and that the three of us can talk about. And so that's really, when I think about representation, that is what it then equals. It isn't just as simple as I got to tell my story and the book became a bestseller. It really then filters back in a micro level into the hands of the kids who need it, and the parents who need it, and the teachers who need it, and the students who need it. And ultimately what it does is it starts to create an environment where we don't just walk in a room and start to pick people apart based off of what we see. We actually go to people and start to talk to people and have a conversation with people. And we start to learn who they are on a human level before we start making assumptions about the who, the what, the how, and just in what they are. And so I think that's my ultimate goal as a non-binary person who is telling this story and doing this activism work, is when I walk in a room, I just don't want people to say, oh, there goes a Black man. I want people to take a minute to think to themselves, I don't know who this person is. And the only way I get to know who this person is if I take the opportunity to start to have that conversation with this person. And I think that's the ultimate goal of everything that I do and all the work that I do in telling the stories that I tell. So it is now 7 o'clock, and so I will turn it back over for any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson. Let's give George a round of applause, please.
Thank you.
All right, Mr. Johnson. Let's see what we have going on here in regards to Q&A. So we have the ability for people to raise your hands. You can just unmute yourself if you would like. You can put your question into the chat box. Also, feel free to use the Google form that's being monitored if you would like to submit your question that way. So at this time, we will open up for Q&A. All right. So George, I'm going to ask you, since a lot of us are in the college environment, and I just saw a hand raised, so I'm going to come back to my question. Nicholas, I see you have your hand raised.
Yeah. So George, you mentioned in like middle school, like people started to like kind of notice that you were different. Did you have like, you know, some of your like friends like kind of like support you and like back you up, or were they kind of like indifferent about that situation?
You know, that's interesting. I was very smart, and so an interesting thing can happen when you have like certain students around you. So like I never got bullied because I always was the I guess the kid that would help like the people who were like the bullies, like with their homework and stuff. So like I never personally got bullied in that way, but I didn't have people who necessarily came to my defense a lot of times when I was dealing with certain things. And interestingly enough, my best friend when I was in middle school, his name is Justin Cepeda. We call each other cousins because we grew up together. He's read the book twice, and he actually sent me a text message maybe about 4 or 5 months ago, like apologizing for middle school. So it is very interesting how people, I think what you're saying, I think is what he was feeling, like he didn't do enough. And I think he saw stuff and knew stuff and just didn't defend me back then, which I mean, but I had no expectation for, someone who's going through their own puberty to defend me. But I think now as adults, he's understanding much better that he wants to raise children who, when they see stuff like that happening with their peers, that they step in. And so I think that was the ultimate thing that he took away from reading it. And again, like we grew up together, like all the way together. And so, so to answer your question, I would say, no, I didn't have people stepping up for me. But again, I had 2 cousins that everybody in the city knew could fight. And so nobody, because I have a second book coming out, and in that book, you will read how my cousins was beating up people on my behalf. So I didn't have to deal with a whole lot because my cousins could fight. So, yeah.
All right. We have a question in the chat box, George, from Mr. Christoph. Using your experience from your time in a fraternity in college, what do you think could be done to increase a sense of community for those still not represented? I want to read it one more time.
Okay.
Using your experience from your time in a fraternity in college, what do you think could be done to increase a sense of community for those still not represented?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, the first step is acknowledgement. We still have a problem with acknowledging the people who exist within the org or within orgs in general, right? Like, and that's just not fraternities. It's like when you look at places like the Urban League, when you look at the NAACP, I mean, we literally are still having yearly arguments around the NAACP Image Awards because you had, and we'll just use this quick example. You have a show like Pose that has won a Peabody, that has been nominated for Emmys, has Emmy winning people on it, that still has never been nominated for an NAACP Image Award. So that alone kind of tells you what the actual issue is. It's not even so much that people can't feel represented. It's just that the people who already exist within the community aren't even acknowledged. And so I think that's where it has to start. Because I always say, like, I can't come out in a community I already exist in. And so when we talk about how do we, feel represented, it's like, well, we already in it. So it's not even about, it kind of moves past that place of like even feeling represented at some point, because it's like, I'm already an alpha and I am non-binary. So that makes me a non-binary alpha. The problem is when they don't acknowledge that I am one. That is where you get into the issues of, well, is this person represented or not, right? We have very effeminate men within our frats. I carry a purse sometimes. There are definitely other members of orgs and fraternities way before me that were carrying purses and bags in social settings. You know what I'm saying? The problem is when we don't acknowledge their presence and we don't also platform them as being images of our orgs. And so I think first is the acknowledgement, and then second is how do we then also make these members images of the org, right? Or images of any of these orgs, right? Like all of the orgs have this image thing. This org is this way, and this org is for this thing, and this org, the men look like this, and we have to act like this. And at some point you have to move past the fact that the image of Black men, the image of Black women, the image of Black people is not a monolith. And once we get to that place of getting in the orgs where we're acknowledging that and we're removing the notion that the image has to be a monolithic thing, I think what you will realize is people will feel represented because they will then realize that, oh, I already do exist within this org. So it's just a matter of the fact I didn't know I existed already in this org. Because I'd be lying if I said trans people weren't already in our organization. They're already there. They're already transgender men who are alphas. I know because I know them. Now, they publicly have not said that, and they publicly may not have said that, but they are already within the org. So it just simply becomes an issue of when do we acknowledge that this thing already exists? We're trying to block something that's already in. And so, yeah, I think that's how we start to move to that place.
George, if I could kind of piggyback off of Christoph's question, we have a Black Greek program tomorrow, actually, and for some of our community members that are on the online right now attending this program, they may not necessarily be knowledgeable much about around like Black Greek life or those Black social service groups that play such a huge part in the Black community beyond college. Could you talk just a little bit about why being a knowledge in those Black groups is important to the Black community and the Black LGBT community specifically?
You said speak about why being acknowledged in
why is that acknowledgement important? Yes,
I see what you're saying. Yes. So there is a difference when we talk about Black Greek life versus Greek life. A lot of Greek organizations are college. Like you do them in college and then y'all may meet up 10 years from now or 15 years from now, or y'all still acknowledge that y'all were members of this org. Our organizations are lifelong commitments. And so when we make those lifelong commitments, we meet monthly for meetings. We do community service outside of college. Like when I pledged at college, when you get out of college, you have to transition into a chapter, what's called a graduate chapter, which is then a place where you go as an adult that you are in for the rest of your life. Now you can switch graduate chapters, but you are a member of the org for the rest of your life. You pay dues every year for the rest of your life. You can become a lifetime member. And so when we talk about these particular type of organizations, NAACP, Urban League, which aren't fraternities and sororities, but are historic Black organizations that have existed for nearly 100 years, if not more than 100 years. These organizations were at the forefront of all movements. They're at the forefront of all, they still carry out major lawsuits. They go to the Supreme Court on behalf of Black people. And so when you look at why it's important that these organizations start to acknowledge that we exist, is because these are lifelong organizations that have heavy ties into every facet of community. You can also add the Black church. The Black church has existed since the 1700s, whether it was the AMEs founded by Richard Allen or whether it was the Southern Baptists. They have all played a major role in who gets to be leaders in our community. They play a major role in who gets elected as politicians. They play a major role in just every facet of Blackness. And so if these orgs are not acknowledging LGBTQ people and are not acknowledging our existence, then we have no power. We have less equity. We have even less equality within the hierarchy of our communities. And so once they start to acknowledge us, one is further proof that we've always existed, but two, it only moves our community forward from the oppressive nature that has continued to plague us.
Thank you, George.
Mm-hmm.
Any other questions? All right. Professor Norton.
Hi, thank you for a really interesting talk, and I especially enjoyed hearing about your grandmother. She sounds like an amazing woman. You also mentioned Toni Morrison's quote. It was Toni Morrison, I believe.
Yes.
And I was wondering if there's anyone else that you would consider a big influence, either on you as a writer or as an activist.
Yeah, I guess my biggest influences, especially like in activism, people like Marsha P. Johnson. I mean, I think about just like how radical that had to be a transgender woman in 1969. Like, and do what you did. I mean, there's questions around whether she threw the first brick at Stonewall or not. Which, the Stonewall riots literally are what gave LGBTQ people rights worldwide, led by Black, trans, and queer people. And so to think that in 1969, she was taking on police. I mean, we're literally talking about George Floyd. Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera and they were fighting the same police departments that we are fighting today, but they were doing it in 1969 when rights were not even close to what they are now. And so I take a lot of cues from people who are our ancestors, like Fannie Lou Hamer, just people who had such a radical feminist lens on how the world had to be when they were doing what they did during extremely unsafe times. I always lean on the words of Toni Morrison, the words of James Baldwin, but I do lean heavily on my grandmother. She, like I said, she is deceased now, but her words are still with me. And so I think about her every day. The newest book that's coming out in September, each chapter starts off with one of her quotes. Because I just have this belief that we have like two levels of quotes of how we hear our ancestors. We have the macro level quotes, which are your Martin Luther King quotes, your James Baldwin quotes, like the quotes that we all pull and that we all know and that we all see, that on a macro level, that's how we live. But then within your own families, we always have that one uncle or aunt or grandmother that is the wisdom. And we, on a micro level in our own Black families, have that person. And so I always say, like, for the macro level, I have my Morrison and I have Baldwin and I have Audre Lorde and those people, and Marsha P. Johnson, who I can lean on and look to and feed from. But on a micro level, I have my grandmother, who always was able to feed me and feed the rest of my family with the wisdom that she learned, that was passed down from her grandmother, and so on and so forth. And so, yeah, those are the people that really guide me every single day.
Thank you. Any other questions from our community? Nicholas.
Oh, I didn't have a question.
Oh, no problem. Dr. Hank.
Oh, you left.
Well, while we wait for Dr. Hank to come back into the room, George, could you tell us a little bit about, a kid in New Jersey decides to go to the South to a small HBCU.
Mm-hmm.
Could you just tell us a few things about, like, how did that happen? Why did you choose to do that?
Yeah, I just had to escape New Jersey. And I write about it in the book. I just had to go. Like, I had just had enough of New Jersey. And I guess in my mind, I had built up, if I could get away from New Jersey, I could finally be who I wanted to be. It just didn't happen that way. But I will say, I think part of it was also my grandmother was from South Carolina. My dad was from Virginia. So I grew up in a very, 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 very Southern home. Even though we were growing up in the North, all of our traditions were Southern. The foods we ate were Southern. The foods we still eat are Southern. I still clean chitlins once a year for my dad. He still calls pig's feet trotters. Like, we grew up in that type of Southern, fatback bacon. Like, that is what I grew up in. And so going to Virginia was not a huge culture shock for me, because I grew up in a very, very country existence. And so it was actually more comfortable for me. And I think, and it's funny, when people hear me speak, they're like, you have a Southern, even though I'm from Jersey. Now, my whole family sounds Jersey. I don't. I never have, but I was always with my grandmother, and she had a Southern accent. And so I just acquired her Southern accent because I was always with her. And then I moved to Virginia for 10 years and it just got stronger. And so I will never have the Jersey accent unless I'm angry or unless I say coffee. So if I say coffee like a Jersey person. There are certain words I say like a Jersey person. But if I'm mad, then I sound like a Jersey person. But other than that, I sound like a Southerner. But being in the South was comfortable for me because that was what I was around the most. And so when I went to Virginia Union, like Professor Murray was like a Southern Black woman that reminded me of my grandmother. Like there were so many professors and people who reminded me of home. It just became second nature to me, like another family to me, which is why I ended up staying there for 10 years.
Not 10 years at Virginia Union, 10 years at Virginia.
Well, 10 years, I did not. And yeah, let's be very clear, because there were some students who it took them between 6 and 8 years to graduate their school. So I graduated in 4, but I lived there another 6 after I graduated.
Okay, just asking for a little clarity. Dr. Hank, did you want to ask a question, sir?
I did. I am so sorry. I disconnected right when we were trying. Well, how you doing? Thank you so much for being here and for sharing your story and your wisdom around this important topic. So as an administrator here at the university, is there any tips, advice, suggestions that you could leave us with or me with how I could continue to do the job of creating space for LGBTQ plus, really honestly, anything around diversity to allow students to feel safe and be able to, you talked about earlier, which I really appreciated around the organization and, so like providing that opportunity to really for people to be themselves in these organizations. And, I do this work, but I think I'm always a learner. And is there any other advice or thoughts you would like to leave us with? I'd love to hear about it.
Yeah, we always, especially because you have a lot of like teachers and professors who are in conservative states. So we always tell them to hide things in plain sight. And so what we do, especially with like a lot of the kids, there are certain YA books like mine that have that. You see how my cover is. And so what we tell teachers to do is like put like certain things on the shelves, if you have shelves in your room, that have either a rainbow flag or something that represents LGBTQ community. It usually will give people, so for instance, like if you're doing Black History Month, put Marsha P. Johnson up, putting certain queer, like known, like that our community know up as a person. It sends a cue to us as students, like, oh, okay, they do know. And so literally it's something just as simple as that. Like if you're doing anything, like having a rainbow sticker that's prominent on your desk next to, even if you have like other stickers of stuff, if they see the rainbow, they literally, a student will be like, oh, this teacher is cool with LGBT people. Okay, cool. We always have to do that because you just have a lot of conservative states where literally you have teachers that can't even say gay in their classrooms. Like they can't say the word. And so we've had to come up with systems around it, which is like we always say, hide it in plain sight. So little things like that will help your students know that you are a queer affirming professor. And I promise you, it's just that simple. Like if I ever walk into any space and see Marsha P. Johnson is hanging, you already know that this space is safe. Like, because that means somebody had to do their work to know who this particular person was. And so doing little things like that go a very, very long way to make queer students feel safer. And what you'll notice is they'll probably come and talk to you if they see it, because it makes them feel like they can have that type of conversation with you.
Thank you.
George, are there other educational resource portals and tools that where we can continue to go to educate ourselves? Because I get what you're saying in regards to hiding things in plain sight, but we may not know what to hide. So,
Yeah.
where do we go to continue this road of education around the Black LGBTQ community? Like, having welcoming you into the space and so forth. But what are some of these other things that we could be doing?
Yeah, and now I'm forgetting the name of the organization. There's a really, really good, like a great organization that does it, and it's slipping me, and I'm gonna have to make sure I provide it to you. But like places like Glisten, Glisten has like so many different guides on how to properly acclimate and create like setups within your rooms, and on how to cultivate that particular type of environment. Actually, I will say the Human Rights Campaign, HRC, over the last 3 years has done a great job of creating resources. That wasn't something that they were doing a long time ago because marriage equality was their main thing. But they, their leadership now is Alfonso David, who was a Black gay man. And I actually helped create the, I believe they call it the African American Coming Out Guide. Even though I changed a lot of the language, I changed it from coming out to inviting in, because that's really what you're doing. And but there's a whole guide that I helped to create within the Human Rights Campaign, and the Human Rights Campaign now has several guides that I'm working on with them that also provide this type of information. I, for some reason, cannot think of the PFLAG is the org. PFLAG is one of the best organizations out there. It is literally the org that teaches parents how to raise LGBTQ children. And they work extensively with universities and teachers and administrators and parents, and they have all kinds of resources. PFLAG is the best resource that you could go to find other tips and tricks to help out with building out classrooms and everything.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Is there any other questions?
I have a question as well as like a statement as well. So it's like a two-part thing. So I would start off like with a statement. So what you said about acknowledgement and representation kind of hit within me with something I've like realized within like looking back in my childhood and growing up in my background in Jamaica. And there was a lot of like homophobic like environments or like homophobic like things said in general, like in every spaces and environment. So that obviously like set the notion in which what's acceptable and what's not. And recently I was a family member confided in me regarding to things as such. And it kind of saddened me because I know what it is. I know what the environment is like. It's definitely not safe. And what you said mainly about representation is like the first step. It reminded me of something I keep seeing online about like a gay agenda, or they're forcing something like that. And it just annoys me because when I do see that, it reminds me as like a Black person, like we're still fighting for equality and stuff like that. But then if you're a Black queer person, it's like worse because within that queer space, they're fighting for like a substance as well within their race. So it just kind of like, even within a minority group, you have such prejudice and you have such like, in every form of it, you have hate going your way. But you mentioned like your chosen family and immediate family and everything. And like chosen family is like something where your friends become your family and sometimes the closest thing to you. And your grandmother was like a support in the ways of such, and other friends. Like, so in what other things other than your like chosen family and your grandmother were like ways you found to survive while growing up, and especially within your second adolescence when dating and stuff like that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I always tell people like the safest place that I've ever been was in like my own imagination and like in my own mind. And I know that sounds really, really, I guess it can sound like crazy at times, but honestly, like that's really the safest place you get to be, because you get to be yourself in your own imagination. And so a lot of survival for me really did come like I learned to be okay with being alone at a very young age. And I think we look at being alone as a bad thing. Like we look at people who are single as people who have not accomplished something. I've gone 35 years. I've never been in a relationship. I joke about it a lot, but I'm happy. Like I am okay alone. And I think that is the one thing that you have to really start to learn is like being alone isn't necessarily like a deficit. Like being alone can be very powerful depending on what you do in your alone time. Writing has always been cathartic for me, which I guess is why I'm doing all this writing. But also one of the other things that I've taken up, which has saved my life, is spirituality. And I think we're noticing a trend where you are seeing a lot of Black LGBT people, and there's LGBT people in general, leave traditional environments like the church and lean more heavily into practices of Yoruba, practices of Buddhism, practices of hoodoo, and practices of ancestor veneration, which is something that I truly believe in. And so, you know, that's, you know, like a universalism in a sense of like, we are all, you know, we all have a purpose in the universe. And what it does is it takes away that, that necessity to have contact with a physical being, and it moves it into a realm where you can have contact with ancestors and ancestral beings. And so like I sage my apartment once a week, and I chant and I sage to clear out negative energy, to prepare myself. I do it every Sunday night at 11:55 before I start the week. In my closet, I have an altar set up, not ALTER, ALTAR. And it's on the altar, I have the obituary of my line brother who passed away, my two grandmothers who have passed away, my grandfathers, and my uncle Horace is also on it. I also have a setup where I have inside of jars their favorite things. So my grandmother was like sugars and spices. So I have things set up in jars for them. And I go in there and I pray every morning to them. And that helps me immensely. And there's a whole spirituality and practice behind it. And I think that has also been one of those saving things for me, because it centers me in the beginning of the day. It lets me know that I'm not alone here, that they're always around me, protecting me and looking out for me. And so, yeah, I think that's the other thing too, is that, you know, when this physical world sometimes gets to be too much, one of the things I want people to know is that there's another world they can go into where they can find solace and protection and safety and grace. And so, yeah, that's how I have made it this far and continue this journey, is through having a really, really strong spiritual practice.
Thank you.
Thank you, George. We're going to close out this evening. Do you have any final thoughts for us as we close out?
Do I have any final thoughts? I don't know. We're in a pandemic. Like things are hard. Like I typically would be doing these type of events in person. So I'm 1 year into Zooming and crowdcasting and everything. I think the one thing of advice I always give is like, you know, just because we're at home doesn't mean that burnout doesn't exist. It doesn't mean that like those same things don't exist. So I always say, give yourself grace. Like we're not just living in a pandemic, we're literally surviving. You know, a lot of people who were here last year are no longer here. And I think, you know, being in America, things just become so normalized so quick. And so it's just like, okay, well, let me put on my mask and let me go back to life. And it's like, one thing I have learned in this is just to kind of take moments to really just take a step back if you need to. Like we don't always have to be on. One thing now that we are in this virtual existence is it is okay to not cut your camera on. Like I'm a big advocate of, if you do not want your camera on, you should not have to cut your camera on. Like some days we just don't have it. And so just remember, like, it's okay to not be okay. Like we are living in a very interesting time. Like, you know, the last time this happened was 100 years ago with the flu. That just, you know, that's wild. And so just to have grace with yourself, and it's okay to not be okay.
Thank you, George. Hopefully you will be able to join us on campus in the near future, and we can host you.
Yes.
We so much appreciate you being with us. Everyone, All Boys Art in Blue. We do have 5 books that will be raffled off over the course of the next week. There will also be a display in the library for during the upcoming week for All Boys Art in Blue. So look out in your emails on how to participate in that raffle. Once again, George Johnson, thank you for being with us. We invite everyone. No problem. Thank you. We invite everyone to join us tomorrow for the Unity with Black Greek Diversity, Meet the Divine Nine, a discussion, a dialogue around Black Greek life within the college space and also within the community as a whole. As all of our members will be members of alumni chapters, graduate chapters within the greater Boston community. So please come join us tomorrow at 6 o'clock. That will be on a Zoom platform. You can find that link in your email and on the Black History Month website. So until then, we will sign off. Thank you so much for being with us this evening. Take care.